You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. And here we are again in a news cycle that simply will not stop. Such relentless breaking news seems to be consistently brought to us by authoritarian, autocratic, wannabe or real despots like Donald Trump or the much more powerful Vladimir Putin. But if we ever needed to be reminded that democracy is at stake in these struggles, well, we're surrounded by the reminder. Still, there's a lot to cover in the stories behind the stories, and in some thoughts I've been having about the layers of fascistic attitudes that still infect all of us. So let's waste no time, but get started by going inside those headlines. The most important thing to remember is that by the time these words land in your brain, everything will have changed. Things are moving so fast that I won't keep repeating the phrase, as of now, but please just factor it in. A little over a week ago, the Russian Federation initiated an unprovoked attack on the sovereign nation of Ukraine, one of its neighbors. Russia has escalated attacks on residential areas of Kiev, Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, and Kherson, a strategically important city of 300,000 near the Black Sea, since it would allow control of the southern coastline and a push west toward the city of Odessa, a major port. Kherson has now reportedly fallen. Mariupol is out of water and electricity and food. In all of these cities and surrounding areas, there has been considerable shelling, mortars and bombings, including the use of some oxygen-sucking explosives outlawed by the Geneva Convention, and lots of killing of civilians. Babin Yar, a world-famous Holocaust memorial site where 35,000 Jews were murdered in a single 24-hour period in World War II, was gravely damaged by bombings. Meanwhile, satellite images show a massive Russian military convoy, 40 miles long, steadily approaching Kiev as the noose tightens around all of Ukraine's borders. Ukrainian men between the ages of 16 and 60 are not allowed to leave the country, in hopes that they will volunteer to fight the Russians, as indeed many, if not most, have. This means that it is women and children who constitute 90% or more of the refugees, which in fact mirrors the international refugee situation itself. More than 1 million refugees, not even counting internally displaced persons, are streaming through and from Ukraine. Back home in Ukraine, across the country, thousands of people, virtually all women and children, are cowering in subway stations and in makeshift shelters and basements, clutching their smartphones and wondering how in hell their 21st century lives have overnight become a reenactment of 20th century European horror. Russia lists its casualties in Ukraine so far as 498 dead and a little over 1,500 wounded. Ukraine reports that there have been 5,710 Russians killed, and Ukraine reports 2,000 civilians dead. There is some good news, and it's deeply moving the way that the world is responding. Because if Putin intended this blitzkrieg to fracture the NATO alliance and erode democracies around the world, as he tried to do in our own elections in the United States, attempting to put and keep Trump in power, he failed this time abysmally. The irony is that his invasion has generated greater unity in the West than ever before, in NATO, in the European Union, even greater unity in the United States Senate. In case you may have missed some of these goodies, I'll scatter them before you like pearls. The United Nations General Assembly has voted to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The only nay votes were those of Russia, Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, and Syria. Tiny Malta announced that it would stop selling citizenship and passports to Russians and to Belarusians to enable them to enter the European Union and the EU financial system. Tens of thousands of people, ordinary people, demonstrated over the weekend across the globe to demand an end to Russia's invasion. They did so in Madrid, Berlin, Paris, Prague, Buenos Aires, Georgia, the country of Georgia, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, etc., and so forth. And most importantly, in Moscow and in 40 other cities across Russia, risking arrests, beatings, and imprisonment to do so, chanting "No to war," while government employees who signed petitions against the war were threatened with dismissal or worse. In St. Petersburg, hundreds of demonstrators protesting for peace were arrested. Most of them were older women. Moscow itself is in an economic panic, given the value of the ruble plummeting toward 1 penny. 1 ruble, 1 penny. Since the United States and the European Union announced unprecedented sanctions, targeting the Russian central bank and after Russian banks were excluded from the SWIFT international payment system. State-owned bank subsidiaries are set to collapse. In an effort to shore up Ukraine's defenses, the European Union moved for the first time to finance the purchase and delivery of lethal weapons. After decades of neutrality, Finland and Sweden have signaled new interest in joining the NATO alliance, while even more autocratic members, like Turkey, have openly denounced Moscow. Switzerland is actually setting aside its long stance of neutrality and is freezing Russian assets. Swiss National Bank data show that Russian companies and individuals held assets worth more than $11 billion in Swiss banks. The International Olympic Committee has recommended athletes and teams from Russia and Belarus be barred from global sports competitions, and FIFA imposed a ban on Russia and its teams only weeks before it was to play in qualifying matches for the 2022 World Cup. Individual Russian sports stars have publicly criticized the invasion. FedEx and United Parcel Service both have suspended shipments to Russia. The credit ratings agency Standard & Poor's cut Russia's government debt rating to junk, which will force managers of Western investment funds to dump their holdings and which will raise borrowing costs for major Russian corporations. The oil giant British Petroleum said it would exit its 19.75% stake in the Russian energy company Rosneft. Shell Oil said it would exit its investments in Russia as well, one day after BP said it would sell its stake in Rosneft. And the International Energy Agency announced that it was releasing 60 million barrels of oil from reserves to ease gasoline prices hit by the invasion, since Russia is expected to shrink crude oil exports dramatically. Apple, Ford, Nike, Disney, and Warner Brothers are among the multinational giants now withdrawing their products from sale in Russia. This is particularly interesting because it demonstrates how much we now have a vital interdependence among nations, one that pokes holes in frontiers. Perhaps this began around 1870, the approximate date when railroads and steamships and telegraphs made possible the creation of what some economists call the first global economy. Oh, and speaking of a wired, globalized world, YouTube now joins Facebook and TikTok in banning Russian state media in Europe, thus impeding Russia's ability to influence the public on Ukraine. As Thomas Friedman pointed out in the New York Times, this Putin-esque planned nightmare has no authentic, for which read sane, exit strategy. Friedman, who is usually pretty savvy about these things, named 3 possibilities of his own: full-blown disaster, dirty compromise, and salvation. The first is too ghastly to contemplate and means, in effect, the wipeout of Ukraine, to be followed by decades of internal insurgency against occupation. In effect, the same kind of never-ending, grinding guerrilla war that drove the Russians, and later the United States of America, out of Afghanistan. The second strategy is that the economic disaster Russia's facing will cause such near-fatal wounds that both sides will feel compelled to accept a dirty compromise, something like a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Russian troops, leaving Ukraine's eastern sections, those already under de facto Russian control, to be formally ceded to Russia. Ukraine itself explicitly vowing never to join NATO, and last, the lifting of all recently imposed sanctions on Russia. Finally, according to Friedman, the least likely scenario, but the one with the best outcome, is that the Russian people, quote, demonstrate as much bravery and commitment to their own freedom as the Ukrainian people have shown to theirs, and deliver salvation by ousting Putin from office, close quote. So we'd all like to think. It's not totally impossible. 3 of Putin's oligarch buddies have publicly criticized the invasion as being very bad for business, especially since the United States has announced that the Justice Department has begun to seize their real estate holdings and their $600 million yachts, each with a swimming pool and a helicopter landing pad. Furthermore, some of Putin's generals have actually expressed a hiccup of concern about the invasion, and the Russian people themselves have been in the streets, courageously protesting. I doubt very much this scenario will come to pass, but then again, you never know. And over all this hangs the literal nuclear option, since Putin has made not-so-veiled threats, and no one wants to go to World War III, even over Ukraine. The truth is that the world, now wired and globalized, has never had to deal with a leader accused of this level of war crimes, a leader whose country has a landmass spanning 11 time zones. This is about empire. This is about Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, and the dream of Mother Russia. Russia is also one of the world's largest oil and gas providers and has the biggest arsenal of nuclear warheads of any nation. So I'd say that the Biden administration has been pretty wise in not taking Putin's nuclear bait and in responding coolly, very coolly, to his provocations. The U.S. has not changed the posture of its nuclear forces, and the alert level has not been raised. This, despite a little-noticed decision by Belarus last December to change its constitution and allow Russia to deploy tactical nuclear weapons within that country, which borders Ukraine and 3 NATO members, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. Oh, by the way, there are some 13,000 nuclear weapons on Earth, in the arsenals of 9 countries. If this is not verifiable insanity, I don't know what is. Now, before we wrap this segment, we do need to pause and return to the subject of those refugees. First, we can't help but notice that the great solidarity the world is expressing for Ukrainian citizens, while totally and understandably earned through individual and collective bravery rarely seen, this solidarity is nevertheless, in no small part, due to another and only recently finally spoken reality. So let it be said. Ukrainians are very white. Since 2011, more than 6.5 million people from Syria, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Eritrea, and many other countries from the global south have sought asylum in Europe. Nationalists boast that antipathy towards such migrants is a centerpiece of their agendas. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has built a razor-wire border fence to keep them out. Poland pushed back refugees from Belarus in the bitter freezing cold last year, releasing water cannon water and tear gas on them. And this past week, Black people, many of them foreign students living in Ukraine, many carrying Ukrainian passports, were not allowed with other refugees on the free train fleeing to Poland. These were Black people from Cameroon, Ghana, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe, and brown people from Syria, India, and one totally lost soul from Afghanistan who had just escaped 4 months earlier from that hellhole. By the end of last week, the European countries above named and the rest of the European Union were scurrying to promise they would now accept everybody coming from Ukraine. But the practice often lags behind the promise, as we know. And finally, especially, they came to the finish line once the world media picked up on the story. Surely we must ask, how is it possible that suffering humanity, fleeing oppression by trying to board a train at the border of a country where they may well be killed if they stay, when these people physically throw off the train 2 women, each the mother of 4 children, doing this so forcibly that one of them cracks her head open after falling? Never mind the so-called denazification of Ukraine, which Putin falsely claimed as his motive for invasion. It's the denazification in each of us we have to watch out for. There's more, lots more, but I'll save some thoughts about all this and about the State of the Union speech for fighting words at the end of the program. In the meantime, mull on this. As the world mobilized in solidarity with the Ukraine, at the Magic Mountain ski area in Vermont, a bartender poured bottle after bottle of Stolichnaya vodka down the drain. We have to take a break, but don't go anywhere because we'll be back in just a moment with Fighting Words. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
A free press. Those are fighting words. If you're wondering what you can do to help an embattled Ukraine, let me right at the top here add to the list of organizations you may already have compiled. Here are 2 more important ones. The Kiev Independent was envisioned and launched by former staffers of the Kiev Post, a well-respected Ukrainian newspaper whose owner shuttered its doors and fired its entire team only 3 months ago in a move considered to be retaliation for editorial independence. Now, relying almost solely on support from readership and donors, the Kiev Independent faces continued financial challenges as its journalists work to provide the world with credible news from Ukraine in English and to counter Russian propaganda and disinformation. In view of the past week's events, the challenges of the paper have grown tenfold. Its survival is now more critical than ever. Their website is KyievIndependent.com. I'll spell it in a moment. And you can explore it, subscribe, or support them by donation and in other ways. And you can also get up-to-the-moment independent news from Ukrainians themselves from it about what's happening in their own country. There is also www.ukrinform.net, which is a multimedia broadcasting platform in multiple languages. Now, Kyiv Independent is KYVIVINDEPENDENT.com. KyivIndependent.com. And Ukrinform is ukrinform.net. ukrinform.net. That's the multimedia broadcasting platform in multiple languages. Now, a note about our current unrealistic reality. I have to call it that because I cannot use surrealism here for what I want to describe, which is surely something others must be feeling, the weirdly out-of-body experience of watching a war in real time take place before our eyes, live, streamed, instantaneous. Forbidden cluster bombs, 8,000 Russian protesters arrested in their own country against the war, the fire and burning of a nuclear plant, real refugees, real tears, blood, war. Vietnam was the first war to be televised, with films a day or so old flown in and then broadcast, and that is often credited with being the final blow in ending the conflict, because when people actually saw the face of war, they did not like what they saw. Well, we've come a long way since then. For one thing, we don't show bodies, dead bodies, anymore. For another, perhaps it's enduring the process of rhinocerization, the coarsening of sensibilities that lets us rather coolly regard what's on our television sets and our smartphones and our tablets and our computers, not quite as entertainment, but possibly as a step closer to that than what we witnessed in Vietnam. I find myself remembering that when I first ran out into the street to look downtown at the Twin Towers on September 11th of that fateful year, as one tower fell in a plume of flame, a guy next to me said, "Wow, it's just like in the movies." Life imitates art? Cooking dinner while watching Kiev fall? Is everything now a video game? Is the world virtual? I tell myself that on the one hand, this is good because it is, after all, a wired world, and communication can spread fast, almost as fast as miscommunication. But surely, I think, if people see it with their own eyes, surely then won't they stop it? Won't they stop the carnage? Rise up and say no more? When the U.S. Civil War began, the Unionists thought it would be over very quickly, so they brought picnic baskets to hills overlooking the battlefields, and they settled in to watch what surely would be short shrift for the rebels. Instead, what happened was the beginning of 4 years of blood-soaked, blood-drenched war. We're not that naive, surely, but I wonder, as I watch otherwise gutsy, principled reporters asking traumatized mothers and kids standing in endless lines or huddled crying in basements, such calloused questions as, "How do you feel? What's it like to leave your whole life behind? Do you have any idea where your husband is?" And perhaps weirdest of all is to watch suffering people try to respond, because they too know how all-important it is to get the word out about their suffering, about, in this case, the plight of Ukraine. The only innocents in this exchange are the youngest children. Everyone else collaborates with sheer information. Now, in general, we all rally well when history presents us with a single bad guy as an adversary. But it's also undeniable that for decades, Vladimir Putin has been intent on weakening democracy around the world. He would be the first to admit it himself. He is the central force keeping authoritarian Lukashenko in power in Belarus. He deployed Russian troops to invade Georgia in 2008. He annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine in 2014, as well as interfering in the 2016 and 2020 elections of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the USA. Furthermore, this has been fairly effective. As the New York Times noted, just 1 in 5 people now live in countries designated as, quote, free, down from nearly 1 in 2 in 2005. This is partly because democratic leaders have done too little to stand up for themselves. But at the same time, autocratic regimes have increasingly worked together to create a cushion against punishment from other governments. For instance, China approved Russian wheat imports this past week, effectively softening the impact of the West's new sanctions. Yet there's a way that this could be turned around to face in the same direction as democracy, to be part and parcel of the very democratic progress that we need and want to see. As one of many examples, since Russian oil fields fuel heavy attacks on democracies around the world, that's all the more reason to disbelieve the lies of fossil fuel companies and to underscore the critical importance of green energy investment. Moreover, other connective elements are at work. 3 specifically. Pre-industrial conquerors could seize land and hold it. But you can't get away with that these days because arbitrary confiscation destroys incentives and destroys any sense of security that an advanced society requires to remain productive. Furthermore, modern war uses massive amounts of resources. Pre-modern armies used limited amounts of ammunition and to some extent could live off the land. As late as 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman could cut loose from his supply lines and march across the state of Georgia carrying only 20 days' worth of rations. But modern armies require enormous amounts of ammunition, replacement parts, and most of all, fuel for their vehicles. The Russian advance on Kiev has slowed and temporarily stalled, likely as a result of continuing logistical difficulties as well as weather. What this means for wannabe conquerors is that even if successful, conquest is exorbitantly expensive, leaving the conquerors ruined or in permanent debt, certainly unable to secure their position. Third, we now live in a world of impassioned nationalism. Ancient and medieval peasants didn't care, or supposedly didn't care, who was exploiting them because it came with the territory and exploitation was assumed. But modern workers do care. They care a lot. These are the kinds of global connections that Biden sought to make, and historical ones, and the ones that he often did make in his State of the Union speech last Tuesday. And you know what? It's time we gave the guy a hats off. First, he entered the joint session with the most diverse cabinet ever in the history of the country. Could we just stop for a sec and think about that and about what getting that accomplished cost and getting that accomplished means? Then he delivered his speech standing in front of the Speaker of the House and the Vice President of the United States, both women, one African and Asian American and one Italian American. Look, you can never accuse me of being an apologist for those in power, but I mean really, that's good stuff. This fuddy-duddy, sleepy old Joe has built 6.5 million new jobs last year, more in 1 year than ever before in the history of the United States. He's made such headway fighting COVID and its variants that we can now celebrate a country where vaccinations are finally up and hospitalizations are down. And in his SOTU speech, he announced the initiation of a new test-to-treat program where Americans can get tested as a pharmacy and, if positive, receive antiviral pills on the spot at no cost. I mean, really? He called himself a capitalist and then went on to say that capitalism without competition is not capitalism but exploitation, which garnered a confused standing ovation from Republicans, who were nonetheless on their feet along with Democrats. And both sides of the aisle rose to their feet for his calls for solidarity with Ukraine, for funding the police in more efficient and compassionate service, and for new protections for veterans. He pushed hard for bipartisan infrastructure support and gave us a laundry list of necessities from child care to nursing homes, from addressing big pharma and negotiating lower prices for Medicare drugs, from affordable housing to deductions for energy-efficient use at home and at work. He negotiated his way around inflation, called for restructuring the tax system, announced a new chief prosecutor for pandemic fraud — that brought both sides of the aisle to their feet — and announced a new FBI unit on klepto-criminals, Putin's oligarchs. He urged votes for the Paycheck Fairness Act, to raise the minimum wage, and on controlling guns, and reminded us all that gun manufacturers are the only business in the country that cannot be sued. He urged passage of the Freedom to Vote Act. He looked straight at Amy Coney Barrett and insisted on a woman's right to choose and maternal health care, both. He declared a ban on Russian aircraft flying through United States airspace, but refused again to engage troops or extend the no-fly zone over Ukraine, thus effectively keeping us out of World War III. He passed the largest economic package since the New Deal, and the whole House was on its feet. Not so bad for a shy, working-class guy who outgrew his stutter and who sometimes seems to drop into those misleading, deceptive dozes. It was quite a powerful performance, and it demonstrated the leadership that some Americans have worried he was lacking. Sometimes our own beloved free press outdoes itself by adopting an arbitrary contrarian stance, especially regarding progressives and liberals, for fear of being targeted as, well, progressive and liberal. And sometimes we progressives exhale such rarefied airs of purity that you'd think we would explode from sheer arrogance. Way too pure for the likes of Biden. Personally, I was touched to see him on Ash Wednesday, dutifully, and I'm sure sincerely, wearing his Roman Catholic ash-besmeared forehead, one day after he had gone to battle for women's right to choice. I like people capable of ambivalence, who can balance differing thoughts at the same time. Biden gets it from all sides: too moderate, not moderate enough, wild-eyed radical socialist, rightward-tilting conservative. Well, maybe, just maybe, he's none of the above. Maybe he deserves a break. The kind of break you might longingly yearn for if Donald Trump were still holding that office hostage. Remember, maybe, just maybe, Biden's the real thing. Maybe, just maybe, someday we will remember him as having been a great president in an exceptionally troubled time. Those are my fighting words. Add yours on Twitter, and remember to tag us at WMC Live and use the hashtag #FightingWords. And that's our show for this week. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and now Instagram at @TheRobinMorgan, and you can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net and find my latest book of poems, Dark Matter, and my brand new novel, Parallax, wherever books are sold. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the Women's Media Center. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. Executive producer as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer of this program, Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us again next time on Women's Media Center Live.